as I say, we're here today to talk about Empire of Pain, which tells the story of how Oxycontin, a pain relief drug, was created and aggressively marketed by Purdue Pharma, a company owned by the Sackler family, whose name is attached to multiple philanthropic medical and cultural institutions, including the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Louvre in Paris, and various Ivy League universities. Oxycontin is a highly addictive opioid, something known to the Sacklers and their allies from very early on, but that made no difference to their aggressive promotion of the drug because, of course, it was incredibly lucrative. The title of our talk today is Drugs and Greed, and this is what we are looking at. It's estimated that at least 250,000 Americans have died from opioid-related causes since Oxycontin came on the market, and that 2.5 million Americans are currently addicted to opioids. Patrick, this book has made a huge stir in the world. You know, is it fair to say it's the most successful of your books to date? That it's sold more, it's been more popular?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked closely in terms of the, in terms of things like how many copies have sold,
Yeah.
but certainly, it's made an impression, yes.
Yes.
And I think that more so than almost anything I've done. It's, a lot of the time as a nonfiction writer, you're describing the world, and you don't really touch the story, you don't really change the story, and this is that rare case in which the book has had something of an impact on the very story that it chronicles, and that's unusual.
And that's a wonderful feeling, I'd say. Like it's because you're a very meticulous writer. You don't necessarily express opinions to a gigantic degree. You're not having a rant. You're telling us the facts so that we can make up our own minds about things. But it must be very satisfying to see this arrogant, greedy family brought low, although not in jail where they clearly belong. So, I mean, basically what you're doing in the book is exposing a really shocking enterprise to keep selling highly addictive drugs to vulnerable people, and eventually leading, after multiple court cases and investigations, to the Sackler family being dissociated from many of the cultural and medical institutions with which they had been connected. The book tells us these stories, and it gives us a really deep insight into the family's origins, relationships, and development, which is all the more remarkable because you couldn't talk to any of them. They desperately didn't want to talk to you. So can you tell us what first attracted you to this story and to these people, and talk a little about their rebuttal of any conversation with you and how you managed to create such an intimate portrait of a family without ever talking to them?
Yeah, of course. So I should say, first of all, it's lovely to be with you all. I wish I could be with you in person.
We wish that too.
It didn't work out to be possible this time around, but I love Galway, and I'd be delighted to come back in person at some point soon. I came to this one through a weird connection. I've always been very interested in drugs as an issue, and I've always been very interested in the line between what's legal and what's illegal, what's considered appropriate and licit, and what we look askance at. And so, even in a book like Say Nothing, I was interested in these questions about, like, well, when is violence considered legitimate, and when is it not? And in terms of drugs, I've always been interested in these kinds of questions of, in the States, we talk about the drugs coming from Mexico and the Mexican drug cartels. And there's this notion that we in America are kind of pure as the driven snow. And this is purely a supply side issue, as though the whole engine for the drug trade and the drug war isn't drug prohibition in the US and the demand of US consumers and US dollars, which are then laundered through US banks. And of course, all the violence that has happened in Mexico over the last couple of decades, which is terrible, happens largely with guns that are purchased in America and smuggled south across the border into Mexico. And so I've always been interested in those types of distinctions. Why is it that in the States we kind of myopically say, oh, look at the terrible people selling illegal cocaine, and we don't focus on the idea of, look at this incredible loss of life in Mexico as a consequence of guns that were purchased in our country, where we have more than 300 million guns. We have more guns than people. And at a certain point, I was looking at the cartels, and there was a period around 2010 when they started sending more heroin into the United States. And of course, because of the way in which we think about these issues in the US, everybody, the kind of initial conclusion was, those capricious Mexicans, what are they up to now? Why did they suddenly decide that we needed loads of heroin? And the answer was that it wasn't a supply side issue at all. It was a demand issue, that there was a sudden surge in demand for Mexican heroin. And that the reason for that, that the answer to that riddle, was opioids, was that you had a generation of Americans who had started out, these are people who in many cases probably wouldn't have gone out and bought heroin on the street and then shot it into their arms with a needle. But what they would do is try a pill from a bottle that had been prescribed by a doctor and sold by a big pharma company and approved by the FDA. And so there was this kind of interesting connection in which the opioid crisis, which starts out as a prescription pill crisis with these very addictive pills, gives rise to a heroin crisis. And that was how I came to it. I was just trying to answer this question: why is it that the Mexican drug cartels in 2010 suddenly started selling more heroin? And the answer is, it's the licit, legal, sophisticated pharmaceutical industry. And so then I started looking into that and the role of these different companies that marketed these painkillers. And I quickly learned that the company that really was the tip of the spear was Purdue Pharma, this Connecticut company, and that was owned by the Sackler family. And this is what really got my attention, because I knew the Sackler name because I'd grown up in Boston, and there's a Sackler Museum in Harvard Square. And I'd gone to college in New York, and I would go to the Sackler wing at the Met. I'd lived in London, and the Sackler name is all over London at the British Museum and the Tate and the National Gallery and so forth. So I was kind of ambiently aware of this name, and that seemed really weird to me, that you had this family that was chiefly known for its kind of extravagant philanthropic giving, and that nobody had really connected the dots and said, but wait a second, the fortune that they are using to do all this philanthropic giving has been generated by this drug, which has this terrible legacy. It's killed loads of people. And so what I wanted to do was connect those two stories, basically, in the form of a kind of a biography of three generations of the family. And to your point, yes, that was my plan. The family was not especially enthusiastic about this idea. They didn't cooperate. They started threatening to sue me before I had even started writing. And so I wrote the book in an atmosphere of high billionaire antagonism. And the challenge for me then was, if you're writing about people who won't talk to you, how do you write in a way that feels intimate, that will feel to the reader not as though you're looking at this family through a telescope, that they're up there in their castle and you're looking at them from a great distance. I want you to feel like you're in the room with them.
Yeah.
And that just requires a lot of work. It means interviewing lots and lots of people, friends, people who've dated them, people who were roommates with them, people who lived in their buildings, housekeepers, doormen, yoga instructors, dozens of employees at the company, anybody I can find who has encountered them, and then digging up letters and depositions, all kinds of things that have come out in court proceedings, and creating a kind of a collage in which hopefully you develop a vivid sense of who these people are.
And we do. It's that they are very, very alive to us in the pages of the book. And it's a remarkable achievement to have been able to assemble all of those different sources. I'm an archivist by profession, and I was fascinated to look at the vast number of legal documents in particular that you had to make your way through. And at one stage you say, there are too many documents, which is, you never hear historians saying that usually, because in Ireland we blew up our history in 1922 and we have too few documents. So this is a wonderful complaint to have, and it means that there's plenty there for the future. But you make such skillful use of it, and you're also very meticulous about acknowledging your sources in the book. So maybe we need to tell people a little about Oxycontin itself, what sort of a drug it is. And then I'd like to maybe just describe that to people. What is Oxycontin? how is it so damaging to people in the way that it is? And then I'd love to look at the whole history of marketing of this drug and what the Sacklers were getting up to with marketing other drugs before it. So maybe start with telling us what kind of a thing is OxyContin?
Sure, of course. I mean, so OxyContin, when we say opioid, what we mean is something that's derived from the opium poppy. And going back, as far as Hippocrates and earlier still, going back thousands of years, humans have known that products derived from the opium poppy have these incredible therapeutic, medical, kind of medicinal qualities where they can alleviate pain in ways that are really extraordinary. But it has also always been known that there's the kind of twin characteristic that comes along with that very benevolent quality, which is that they can be very habit forming and very addictive for some people. Not everyone, but for a lot of people. And so there's always been this sense that those are the two kind of inextricable traits of the opium poppy, that it can help you, but it can also hurt you, and that it's very difficult to disentangle the two. And in the 1970s and 80s, on both sides of the Atlantic, there was a generation of doctors who said, we've been really under-treating pain. We haven't been taking pain seriously enough. We've been thinking of it as a symptom of other problems, but not really aggressively dealing with pain itself. And some of them thought that there was a kind of hysteria that had prevented doctors from prescribing such drugs more often. So at the time, it was morphine, which is also an opioid. And morphine was something that was in the medicine cabinet, right? But people had memories of periods in the past when you had a lot of morphine addiction. So there was a sense with morphine and drugs like it that it was kind of the thing you kept on the top shelf. You would reach for it when other remedies had failed. A lot of the time, morphine would be the kind of thing that you would use in end-of-life care, extreme cancer pain, situations in which the pain is very acute, and at a certain point, any concerns that you have about the addictiveness seem less significant than whatever the immediate therapeutic emergency is. And into this world comes Purdue Pharma, initially with a morphine drug called MS-Contin, which was a big success. And then subsequently with OxyContin, which was another opioid, oxycodone, which was generic at that point. That is to say, it was no longer patented, and actually is much more powerful than morphine. But the idea is when you say OxyContin, the oxy part is oxycodone, which is the generic opioid. The contin is short for continuous. So the idea was we have a capsule that goes around this pill that will regulate the way in which the drug enters your bloodstream. So you can take, in theory, one pill every 12 hours and slowly, a really big pill, a kind of a jumbo pill, will slowly filter into your bloodstream. It's almost like being on a drip, you can imagine, but in pill form. And that was their idea, and they wanted to market it not just for those extreme types of pain for which opioids have been used in the past. They thought, there's only so many people who have cancer, right? We want a bigger market. We want chronic pain. We want moderate pain, not just severe pain. And so they come up with this tagline for the drug. I kid you not. I mean, it's funny to think back on, but at the time, their actual marketing slogan for OxyContin was, "It's the one to start with and the one to stay with." Which, if you're selling drugs, great formula.
Yes.
Start prescribing early and never stop. And the hurdle that they faced was that, of course, physicians would be reluctant to do so out of concerns about addictiveness. And so what the company said was, "Oh, don't worry, it's not addictive. That's all an old wives' tale. We've cracked it. Because of our special coating, it won't be habit forming." They didn't know this. They hadn't conducted studies to this effect. But they launched this kind of marketing blitzkrieg to change the mind of the medical establishment about the dangerousness of these drugs. And in ways that I'm sure we can discuss, they were fantastically successful. So they really engineered a big paradigm shift in terms of the way doctors prescribed these drugs. And in so doing, they generated this blockbuster drug, OxyContin, which I think it's earned some $35 billion in revenue since its introduction in 1996. So a hugely successful drug. but also it turned out that they were wrong in supposing that it wasn't addictive.
Is it true to say supposing, or did they know from an early stage that it was addictive?
Well, they knew from very early on. So they introduced the drug in '96.
Yeah.
And there's you're right to ask the Watergate question, which is what did they know and when did they know it? And it's the company doesn't officially acknowledge that anything is wrong until 2001, by which point a lot of people have died. And there are internal company records indicating that they knew, as early as kind of 97, 98, that there were real problems. There's somebody who said that even internally inside the company, they were referring to it as hillbilly heroin. So there was certainly an awareness from very early on, certainly much before the point at which they publicly acknowledged they know there's a problem, that people were indeed abusing this drug. They were getting addicted to it. They were overdosing, and they were dying. The kids were dying from the drug pretty early on.
I suppose part of it is the physical makeup of the drug. We might need to tell the audience. You can take the drug as a pill, but you can also grind it up and turn it into a powder which could be snorted, which some people did avail of the drug in that kind of way, which in a way gave the Sacklers a way out, because they could say that people who were using the drug according to the instructions they were given didn't become addicted, whereas others who were clearly a lower form of life were snorting the powder. And one of the reasons why things changed in 2010, as Patrick brilliantly demonstrates in the book, they changed the formulation of Oxycontin so that you couldn't grind it down into a powder any longer, couldn't be snorted, and that's what led to the demand for heroin that was so instantly satisfied by the Mexican cartels. But there was also an issue about the time release aspect of it that you eloquently described to us just now. It was supposed to last for 12 hours. In fact, it didn't. It lasted for 8 hours, as you proved to us, which meant people who were innocently taking this drug for pain relief, and anyone who's been in pain knows how lovely it is to get some relief from it. Everybody wants to do that. We're finding that its efficacy was running out after 8 hours and having to take bigger doses. Or if they stuck to the instructions given by the company, having withdrawal symptoms. So this becomes apparent, I think, fairly early, Patrick, that the time release thing is fake, doesn't work. They still don't do anything about it, though, do they?
Yeah, I mean, even before they'd released the drug, before they'd gotten approval from the FDA, they had these studies that they were running where a large number of people who were given the drug, there was a study of women, I think they were recovering from postpartum pain in a hospital in Puerto Rico, and some significant number of those women were reporting, listen, you say it works for 12 hours, but after 8 or 9 hours, my pain is coming back. I need more. And there's two kind of important points here, right? One is that this whole story is a story about marketing.
Yeah.
And on a grander level, it's about the Sackler family's marketing of their own name and their own family, and sort of it's mutton dressed as lamb, right? It's taking one thing and making it look like another. And in the specific context of the drug itself, having you can see why, from a marketing point of view, having a painkiller that you only have to take every 12 hours is a really appealing idea. Because if you're somebody who's suffering from terrible pain, it means you can sleep through the night. It means you don't have to wake up in the middle of the night to dose again. So there was a very strong commercial incentive to make that claim for the drug. And the problem is that if you have a drug that is prescribed on a 12-hour basis, and then some significant number of people are finding that they are back in pain and maybe even experiencing a kind of withdrawal by 8 or 9 hours, that's actually a recipe for addiction and abuse. And so, but this is where we find ourselves. The craziest thing is that to this day, you're quite right that the Sacklers, when the company finally did acknowledge that there was a problem in 2001, they said, "Oh, but the problem isn't the drug.
It's the people."
The problem is the users. Yeah, it's the people with their poor moral constitution. It's these people with addictive personalities who are treating the drug like a party drug. And it's certainly true that there were some people who did treat the drug that way. I should say, just parenthetically, it didn't help that in the early bottles of OxyContin came with a warning, which for a certain kind of user also operated as an instruction manual, where it said, no matter what you do, don't grind the
it
drug
up.
up, because you'll get a huge hit of oxycodone all at once. But there were also lots and lots of patients who were, quote unquote, legitimate pain patients, people who were suffering terrible pain. The doctor prescribed OxyContin. They took it exactly as the doctor ordered and found that they still were kind of caught up in a sort of physiological undertow, feeling themselves wanting to dose more, feeling as though they were captive to this drug.
It's a shocking story. But it's not the first time that the Sacklers, you have a wonderful portrait of the family. Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond are the three original brothers who originated in Brooklyn around when? Give us their starting dates in life.
So they were born in the early decades of their parents came from Central and Eastern Europe right around the turn of the last century, and the brothers are born in the 19-teens and come of age really against the backdrop of the Great Depression in Brooklyn.
And their father says to them when he loses all his money, I may have lost my money, but I've given you something very important, and that is your good name. Make sure to hang on to it. They ignored that advice, I'm afraid, very seriously. But Arthur, who's the eldest brother and the most interesting of them all in lots of ways, the kind of driving force behind what happens in the family, I was amazed to read in the book that when he was in high school, he was putting ads for cigarettes into the high school magazine. Those were the days when people thought cigarettes were good for you. I wish those days would come back. I've just given them up and it's killing me. But what are you going to do? We know now. We know what we didn't know then. But later we find him and his brothers who all become medical doctors, psychiatrists, and they're in a particular medical institution. They start looking at pharmacology for mental illness, another great and interesting story of the 20th century. The search for solving all of our problems with drugs rather than other kinds of ways of going about it. They begin to promote the sedatives Librium and Valium, in which they don't have a stake, but they're going to make money out of promoting it, for a broad spectrum of anxieties, exactly as Patrick said about OxyContin, not just severe pain, but moderate pain. In this case, any kind of anxiety. If your daughter is worried about going to college, Librium might help her, to the extent that one doctor said, what do we not use these drugs for? Like, is there any condition that Librium and Valium are not going to sort out? So this sounds like an early playbook for how they marketed OxyContin. And, it's actually true that this book is as much about advertising as it is about the drug itself, about their marketing of this, how they learn how to do this early. And they follow that playbook right through with OxyContin afterwards. So maybe talk a little bit about the early activities with Librium and Valium and how that went on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you picked up on that, because it's it was as a writer sitting down to write a book, there are all of these threshold questions about what your aperture is going to be, what you're going to look at, what's in the frame of the story and what's out. And OxyContin isn't introduced in this book until about halfway through the book, which was quite a deliberate choice, because I thought there was this fascinating prehistory with the family, and what was so intriguing about it was that in looking at 3 generations of the family, starting with those 3 brothers and then getting through to their grandchildren today,
they don't improve as they go on.
It's not as though it's a kind of no, indeed, but it's also not as though it's a kind of just a random biography.
Okay, you're frozen just for a moment. Let's hope that the geniuses up here can get you back. Let's see where we go. Let's be patient for a bit. No, they don't improve as they go on, the Sacklers. These people start off with nothing. Their parents lose everything. But education is a big virtue in their family, and they get educated and become professionals and use that advantage to eventually establish this company that creates OxyContin and all of the trouble that is involved there. Are we okay, lads, up there? Just be patient. Is that it? Okay. He's giving me a thumbs up sign, which means things will come back. But when we get through this again now, we're going to talk about the pantheon of villains who assisted them, many of whom are professionals, doctors, lawyers, and particularly regulatory agencies, particularly the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which has allowed this drug to find its way into people's noses and stomachs without any interference for a very long time. So hopefully he'll be back in a minute and we can catch up then. Let's see where we're going. Yes.
Are you back?
Sorry? You okay? I can see you up there, Patrick. Can you hear me? You can't.
Nope, there you are.
There we are. Can you see me or hear me, or are we all right?
I can hear you now, yeah.
You can hear me now, okay. Sorry for that brief thing. Zoom is like a seance, you know, so spirits trying to get into. There's somebody trying to make contact here. So glad to have you back. Glad to see you back. I can't see you on the screen here, so I'm looking up at you, which may be a bit weird for you. But yeah, there you are again. That's great. Now we're cool. We can get back. So while you were absent in the spirit world, I was telling them all about the bunch of villains with whom the Sacklers surrounded themselves, which of course is a classic American story, that you want to do something that is clearly wrong, and you have to co-opt people to help you do it. In this case, and it's part of their huge marketing campaign, doctors are the beginning, are they not, in terms of co-opting doctors to praise this drug, about which doctors, and we have to remember that doctors instinctively wish to help people in pain. They have a patient who's in pain, they want to help with that. If they think usually they can do that safely, they will do it, and they should do it. Mind you, my GP is trying to stop giving me sleeping pills, and I've told her they're a human right, and I must have them. And what does she know about insomnia anyway? She never had it. So those arguments will continue about pain relief and sedatives. So they do surround themselves with doctors and regulators, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about that, because even when serious red flags emerge about the dangers of Oxycontin, they continue to be able to market it and to get new markets for it in Canada and in England, for example. So talk about the doctors and the FDA in particular, who seem to me to come out of this stinking to high heaven as really poor regulators of this drug and who could have put a stop to it much earlier. Did you get that, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, cool.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
You can? One thing that I thought a lot about as I was writing is the awesome power of private money.
Yes.
To co-opt public institutions and various neutral parties into the overall enterprise. And so in the case of the FDA, I mean, one thing people say is, how could this drug, the Sacklers, if they were here with us today, and the thought did occur to me that might have been them who intervened a few minutes ago.
It was Arthur's ghost haunting you.
Assuming that wasn't Arthur's ghost and I'm just being paranoid. They would say, we never did anything wrong. All we ever did was sell a drug that was approved by the FDA.
Yeah.
And how much of a get-out-of-jail-free card you consider that to be depends a bit on how much faith you have in the FDA. But it does seem worth noting, and I'll tell you this very briefly, though I walk through the story at great length in the book.
You do.
The fellow at the FDA whose job it was to sign off on Oxycontin signed off on the drug, signed off on these bogus marketing claims about how it wasn't addictive and so forth, and then decided it might be time to leave the FDA.
That's right.
And within about a year, he took a job at, wait for it,
Guess where?
For three times his government salary. And there's nothing illegal about that, I should say. I mean, it's, there's nothing illegal about it. It stinks, I think anybody could look at that and say that doesn't seem quite right. But he did. And in terms of the doctors, you know, it's an interesting thing. There may be physicians in the audience. I've spoken to a lot of doctors about this, and it's funny because what many of them will say to me is, oh, you know, I know that the pharmaceutical companies, they make all these blandishments, they try and sort of seduce us and get us to do what they want, but I'm a doctor. I would never be influenced by such things. You know, there's a sense, I think, within the medical profession of doctors as having a kind of, I mean, God, I hesitate to use the expression with an Irish crowd in 2022, but a priest-like virtue. That there is that there's a, you know, that this is a profession that is somehow beyond reproach.
Yeah.
That they would be incorruptible. And I tend to think, and you know, actually to go back to the priest issue, I mean, having grown up in Boston myself, and watched the way the Catholic Church scandals unfolded there, part of the problem, part of the reason those scandals went on so long, was that there were a lot of people who couldn't imagine a scenario in which priests were corruptible. There was a sense that they're totally beyond, you know, any sort of, and I actually think that that's kind of a recipe for corruption. And so it was a similar thing with the medical profession, right? There was this notion that, well, doctors would never be influenced in this way. Arthur Sackler used to say, no doctor would never be influenced by advertising. I'm just doing medical education. Which of course is nonsense, but this is the way it works. And in the case of Purdue, you know, they would have these weekend getaways where they would invite doctors to pain seminars, all expenses paid. And they would pay some doctors to give speeches to other doctors about the virtues of OxyContin, and everybody would have a grand time. And the doctors who went would say, oh, well, I wasn't influenced by that, you see. It was just a weekend. You couldn't change the way I prescribe with a steak dinner. But I've seen the internal records from Purdue. And some years they were spending $9 million a year just to buy food for doctors. And they looked at the return on investment on every dollar they spent that way. So yeah, it's quite troubling, to be honest with you.
It's very troubling. And particularly the FDA example, because if you can't count on regulators, as we're finding in this country too, there's one, I mean, the fight back begins with people who are victims of the opioid crisis. There's a woman called Nan Golden, whom you describe, who's a truly wonderful person, who has an addiction of her own, who recovers. She's an artist, a photographer, and she sets up an activist group to try to deal with the Sacklers, bursts into museums whenever there's something going on, and does interesting installations and events and happenings, as we used to call them. And there are also court cases. I mean, one of the most interesting is Maura Healey, another great woman, who's the district attorney in Massachusetts, who gathers a huge amount of information about the Sacklers and has it in for them, like is not wanting to let them away with any of this. But there's a beautiful quote from her deputy, Joanna Lydgate, because we all think about lawyers. Well, actually, I think we all think about lawyers very unfairly, perhaps. That old joke, what are 50 lawyers at the bottom of the sea? A good start. We don't want to think like that about them. Some of my best friends are lawyers. We don't want to go there. But lawyers who are defending the indefensible consistently and over a long period of time need to be examined. And Joanna Lydgate said to one of the lawyers for Purdue, everyone is entitled to a lawyer, but it doesn't have to be you. And that is a magnificent statement to make to people who are doing all of this. So I don't know what you think about this, but for me, you've created a pantheon of villains surrounding the big villains in the middle, who are the Sacklers and their descendants, right down to the latest generation. But they couldn't have done any of this without the enormous amount of help that they get from professionals, doctors to whom we're all deferential still, partly because we're afraid they might kill us if we don't do the right thing and be nice to them, and lawyers too. Like, you talked about the power of private money, and is that what it's all about? Is this just greed at the bottom of all of this, or is there more to it?
No, I think it is. I mean, I think it's such an important point, and I think that they're thinking about it. To me, the key is that I think there there are these circles of ostensibly neutral, professional, respectable service providers and influence peddlers who 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 abet the worst kind of behavior. And so, when we have these big scandals, whether it's the Sacklers or Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein, and finally in the end the truth all comes out, and then everybody says, God, that's appalling. Like, how could it have gone on for so long? How could it only be now, when there were things that we should have known a decade ago, and yet these people were being celebrated and feted until quite recently? How could they get away with it for as long as they did? And the answer is always, I think, lawyers, PR spin doctors, consultants from places like McKinsey.
Yeah.
There are all these people who are all too quick, I think, to take the money and play mercenary. And listen, it's perfectly legal for those people to do what they do, but I think they should be pariahs. The first character you meet in Empire of Pain is Mary Jo White,
Yes.
who is
Frightful.
a very famous lawyer in the States, and a hero to many. And she's worked for the Sacklers for 15 years more, nearly 20 years. And in my book, that means that she's perfectly entitled to do it, but the notion that she would be considered a virtuous figure in legal circles is a little hard for me to take seriously.
It's very interesting when the wonderful district attorney, Maura Healy, comes up against Mary Jo White, because she was a mentor of hers and a friend, and she said, I'm not going to talk to her. She can do whatever she wants. I'm not having a conversation with her. And manages to stand up to the pressure that's there. It's an interesting moment. She doesn't cut her off, which maybe she should have, but she's not going to engage with her in any friendly way about this. And in a way, that's the beginning of a turnaround on the issue.
But there's also, and I should say, I mean, the one thing I would add to that, and part of this, right, is like, I'm a creature of this world. I mean, I went to Columbia for college, where the Sacklers gave a bunch of money. I went to Yale Law School.
Yeah.
I went to law school myself, which produces the kinds of people who end up at the kinds of firms that defend the Sacklers. I think part of what Maura Healy was getting at is there is a thing that elites do.
Yes.
People they went to the same schools, they know a lot of people in person. There is a sense that if you send in that kind of gray flannel,
Patience. Get there. See, okay.
and there is a sense that they have something in common culturally, socially, that's what happens, is that in a back room you send somebody who knows the prosecutor, and they call them off, and she didn't want that to happen.
It's interesting. There's a satisfying chapter at the end of the book where you detail the removal of the Sackler name from various cultural institutions and universities, and also their reaction to this, which is, how dare they do this to us? Our children are suffering, as if children all over the bloody country haven't been suffering agonies from their dreadful marketing of this drug. Are there any institutions left that still bear the Sackler name, Patrick?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there are some real diehards. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London.
So I suspected, yeah.
Go there soon. No, they love the Sacklers. The Oxford University, no intention of renaming the Sackler Library at Oxford. Very, very grateful for the Sacklers' generosity.
Take note of these names, audience. There should be letters written and people contacted. So Oxford, the V&A, anybody else we need to target?
I'm sure there are others. Those are the two holdouts where they actually, they seem almost to take a kind of blinkered pride in it,
Okay.
Yeah.
That's disgusting. That's really, really shocking. And it's interesting that despite their vaunted philanthropy, the Sacklers, who gave tons of money I don't know if many of you who've been to New York and been to the Metropolitan Museum, which is one of the great museums, will know the Temple of Dendur, which is the beautiful Egyptian temple. Arguably should have stayed in Egypt where it belongs instead of being co-opted over to America. But there it is, standing in its own beautiful wing with glass walls all around it so you can see it from outside. That is dedicated to the Sackler family, or was, until the Met saw the light and took their name off it. That's just one example of what can be found. How much did it trouble the family when they discovered that their names were being removed from some of these prestigious projects?
Oh, I think very much. I mean, part of what's fascinating about this story is it is a story with a mild spoiler alert for those who haven't read the book. This was always going to be a story where the bad guys get away with it in the end.
Good man.
And the Sacklers are not going to face criminal charges. Yeah. They've kind of done a deal through the bankruptcy of Purdue where they're going to pay a hefty sum of money, but they will get essentially immunity from any future civil litigation. They haven't apologized. They have a sense that the real victims in this story are the Sackler family. That this is all just a big misunderstanding. They have a kind of slightly Trumpian disconnection from reality that I think is actually it's sort of an affliction of being a billionaire, is when you're surrounded by people who believe that their livelihood depends on telling you that your every crazy idea is correct, you can become quite delusional. And so I don't think that they realize quite how bad it all is.
Let's hope it breaks through to them at some point in the near future. It'll be interesting to watch what happens then. We're at...
But
sorry, go on, Patrick. Interrupted you.
But this story, you quoted Isaac Sackler. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I do think that there's an irony that this family that spent 7 decades putting their name up on buildings, that there's a sort of poetry to the idea that their punishment, it's not punishment enough, but that the way in which they're going to be punished is to see that name come down.
Yeah. Their father's good name, that they were told to cherish. It's also fascinating. I'm going to go to the audience now in a moment so you can ask Patrick some questions. But to me, the American system of philanthropy is fatally flawed. Instead of making very rich people pay more tax and using those tax receipts to build cultural institutions and decent institutions in our universities and all the rest of it, we rely on people like the Sacklers, or America does, to give vast sums of money. This is creeping into Ireland too, of course, where universities now have to spend a lot of their time and energy fundraising instead of relying, as we should, on the citizens and the state to fund our education systems. Cultural institutions like the Met should never be beholden to people like the Sacklers. And Patrick, of course, wonderfully kind of expresses in the book how it's easy to become blinkered to where the money comes from if you need it badly and you need to apply it to a glorious project like the Temple of Dendur or whatever it may be. So we're going to go to the audience now, Patrick, and see if there are questions for you, which I'm sure there will be. There will be a roving mic. Someone here in the second row. Where are we? Coming along now. Cool. There we are. Great.
Hey, Patrick. I was just wondering, for a TV show like Dope Sick, on the opioid crisis in the States, what do you think they did well and could have done better, basically?
Oh,
That's a hard one.
So I didn't have anything to do with Dope Sick, but it was made by people I know, and Beth Macy, whose book it's based on, is a friend of mine, and I think her book is terrific. I thought that the best stuff in Dope Sick was about the nature of addiction. I thought that Michael Keaton's portrayal of somebody, of a doctor who then becomes addicted himself, I thought was really quite profound. I should say this isn't in a lot of the publicity, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Michael Keaton actually lost a nephew to the opioid crisis, so I think he has a personal connection to this story, which it's hard to express to people in another country how widely this is felt here. Like any time I ever go out and do a reading, somebody comes up afterwards and tells me that they've lost a loved one, like a child or a sibling or a partner. and so I thought that the whole handling of that was humane and beautifully done. I thought that their discussion of medically assisted treatment, it's another weird thing in America where one of the ways to help wean people off of opioids is with other drugs. So it's medically assisted. But of course, with our kind of slightly puritanical approach to these things, sometimes there are people who object to that, which I think is, I'd say just cold turkey is the only way, which I don't necessarily think is the answer. So I thought all that was really well handled. The Sacklers, I thought they were a little bit caricaturish in Dope Sick. I think they were a little bit mustache twirling and like they don't, when they meet for their board meetings, they don't actually meet in the Sackler wing of a museum. That was kind of a colorful choice. I half expected them to be like eating grapes and drinking wine, but but no, listen, by and large, I thought it was a really powerful series and one that has a lot of integrity and is telling an important story.
Okay, anyone else down here in the front row? There we go.
The FDA approved it, and a year later, the government official left. Are FDA rulings so written in stone that if afterwards it appears that there's something wrong with that ruling, that it's not overruled, as it seems to be in this case?
So they did, it's a great question. They did amend a whole series of things at the FDA. There were claims that were made initially about the drug that they dialed back. They didn't have sufficient warnings in the beginning, and they subsequently had much more dramatic warnings. This is all in the packaging of the drug itself. But so in that respect, I think the FDA has learned from its mistakes, kind of too late, in a way. The horse was out of the barn at that point. But listen, it's a long story, and I detail this in the book at greater length, but I sued the federal government under the Freedom of Information Act because I wanted to get all the emails of that guy. His name is Curtis Wright. Because I wanted to know, when did he start talking to the company about leaving to get a job? Was he still working in the government when they were talking about this? And in my lawsuit, I got a federal judge to order the FDA to turn over thousands of pages of documents to me. And when I asked for Curtis Wright's emails, they said, "Oh, we're terribly sorry, we can't give you anything. You see, all of his documents have either been lost or destroyed."
We know that excuse.
This to me doesn't feel like an agency that is trying to learn hard from its past mistakes.
That answers your question, I think. Anyone else here? Okay, over here. Sorry, you have it there. Okay.
I'm always impressed by the level of access you achieve and the trust and candor you elicit from your subjects. I'm wondering if you could talk about that process or that skill as you've cultivated it as a writer, and perhaps specifically how it pertains to building character in nonfiction.
Thank you. I mean, a couple of points. So one is that so in this new book I have rogues, there's 12 stories, and I think in about 6 of them, the main people in the story didn't talk to me. And in Empire of Pain, it's like a biography. It's a fairly, there's some hubris, right, in the idea that you would write a biography of a family, 3 generations of a family, none of whom will talk to you. And in Say Nothing, there were 4 major characters, and none of them, 3 of them were dead, and the 4th was Jerry Adams, who didn't particularly want to sit down with me. So it's often the case that I don't get access, and in a weird way, that doesn't stop me. For me, that's never the end of the story. That's always the beginning of the story, where I say, okay, well then how would I go about telling the story if I can't get access to the person? And in a weird way, I think that actually helps with access, because when I'm talking to people, what I will tell them is, you can talk or not talk, but if you don't talk, that doesn't mean I'm not gonna go away. I'll write anyway. I'll find everybody you've ever known, and it may take some time, but I will knock on doors and look people up, and so I sort of make a promise. It's not a threat, right? But it's more just saying, of course you have the prerogative to sit this out, but like the article is eventually going to come out. So wouldn't you want to take the opportunity to let me hear how you see it. And, sometimes that doesn't work. But sometimes it does. And a lot of the time what'll happen is somebody will initially say that they don't want to talk to me, and then I'll just spend months talking to other people around them, and they'll keep getting messages saying like, oh, I was just talking to that fellow from the New Yorker. Oh, I got a call from this guy. And when I interview people, I try and just be open-minded, and often the interviews are really long. And I think that the impression that people get, I hope, is that I'm not doing a drive-by, that I'll do the work, I want to get really deep into it. And sometimes it helps if there's somebody who won't talk to me, but I talk to somebody who they know, and we talk for 2 hours, and they can tell by the tenor of my questioning that I'm not doing some quickie hit job. I really want to understand what's happening. And then hopefully they communicate to the first person, no, he seems serious, actually. He seems to really want to hear what you have to say. So I think all of that is part of it. And then part of it is that I try and keep an open mind. I mean, even when the people that I'm writing about have done atrocious things, it's not that I don't pass judgment eventually, but in the reporting, I don't think it helps anybody to have me kind of sit in squinty-eyed judgment and just say, well, clearly you're a psychopath, and there's nothing that you could tell me about how you got to where you are that would be edifying for readers. That's not my view at all. Even with really, truly awful people, even with real psychopaths, I want to know what their journey was. I don't believe anybody was born evil. And so I kind of want to know how they got to the place that they are.
One more question. Down here. Just hang on a minute. We'll get a mic to you. Just here. Lovely. Thank you.
Patrick, you have had predecessors dealing with this problem in the US. I'm talking about basically the revolving door, not only between the FDA and the various pharma industries, but the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, and we know what that has led to, and of course Wall Street, and yeah. So, for example, you've had a man called Peter Gritschke who wrote a book called Medicines and Greed in 2013. Basically, he talked, the subtitle of which is called Who Has Killed More Than the Mafia? And we have in Britain a young psychiatrist called Ben Goldacre, who has been documenting the nightmarish scenario that obtains, for example, for psychiatrists to deal with what they don't know, what's in the drugs. In Ireland, we have Professor David Healy, who got fired from his job as a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto when he exposed the behavior of GlaxoSmithKline on the subject of how they developed Seroxat, where he discovered that in the control group, in other words, he had 2 days to examine 250,000 files, but he discovered that in the control group, the people were getting suicidal, yet this was going on the market. So there's a long litany, but in Ireland, we live under the problem that there isn't a critical voice whatsoever. You will not get it published in the Irish Times, so it was quite a surprise to me to see a documentary on the Sackler family on television about a year ago. I haven't got a question for you, but...
That was what I was going to ask you.
Well, the general question, of course, is what gives rise to the conditions for these things to happen? For example, GlaxoSmithKline got fined $3.5 billion for putting Seroxat on the market to under 18s without clearance from the FDA. But there's an American psychiatrist who wrote a book called Saving Normal, where he, in his book, he talks about the hall of shame, all the fines to the various drug companies, which don't seem to amount to anything. In other words, the moral critique is empty. In other words, we're getting a radical expression of bourgeois cynicism right through the whole system. And the Sackler family is just one example.
Absolutely. I'm going to stop you there because we are in trouble about time. Patrick, would you like to conclude our wonderful event this afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, I know there wasn't a question, but I will exercise my prerogative. to say, listen, I quite agree. I mean, I think what we would call regulatory capture is a huge problem. There's a problem that I explore in the book as well, which is that I think that increasingly, I think part of the problem, to your point about the fine for GlaxoSmithKline, is that it is very rare to see criminal prosecutions of corporate executives. So increasingly what happens is a corporation misbehaves, the corporation gets busted, the corporation apologizes, the corporation pays a fine, and none of the people who made the decisions face any individual accountability. And I don't think you're going to see a real change in corporate behavior when there are billions of dollars to be made, unless those executives, when they make their own decision-making calculus, realize that prison time is a potential variable for them. And so you get this in Empire of Pain. There are 2 guilty pleas by Purdue Pharma, one in 2007, one in 2020. They pay these huge fines. No executives go to prison. The second time around, no executives were even named. I say in the book, it's as though the corporation were a driverless car. How does the corporation commit crimes if no executives committed crimes? And so to me, that's really the rub and where I would like to see some changes.
Roll on the day, but I don't see it happening anytime soon, unfortunately. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today and for illuminating your wonderful book, and I recommend it to all of you. It's a truly wonderful read, and make sure to buy the collection of essays, and make sure to read him in The New Yorker, which he will continue to write for. And remember that TLDR is anathema to all smart people, which all of you are. Thanks again, Patrick.